Hello, everybody. I hope you guys can hear me. Well, I guess if nobody complains, then it probably means you can hear me. So, yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity to present my work, also virtually. You know, I hope I will eventually make it to Portugal. So, we will shift gears a little bit compared to the previous two talks. And so I'll present work today that was primarily performed by Anirudh Galgali, who was a PhD student and then a postdoc in my lab, is now in Oxford. We collaborated with Manish Sahani at Gatsby, and all the data that I'll present was collected in the laboratory of Bill Newsom in Stanford. So I'll start by showing you one of my favorite examples of what computation through dynamics can be. And so this is work by Christian Mackens, Ranulf Rom, and Carlos Brody, where they looked at responses in prefrontal cortex of monkeys that were trained to solve a particular discrimination task, which is shown on the top left. So the monkeys were presented tactile stimuli that had different frequencies, and so the task was to you know, perceive a first frequency F1, and then they had to wait to get a second stimulus with frequency F2, and the decision was about whether F1 was larger than F2. And, you know, without going into any details of the task and actually also of the responses, one of the key insights really of this paper was that what are otherwise hard to interpret responses in prefrontal cortex can actually be understood with a relatively simple model, which assumes that the population response represents the evolution of a relatively simple dynamical system, which is shown on the right. And so these colored balls that you can see, those represent the state of the population activity, and it can move along this horizontal axis, which represents some one-dimensional manifold of activity patterns. And the effect of the recurrent dynamics is then represented by this energy function, which you can see along the vertical axis. And so the dynamics is such that the population response always falls down this energy landscape. And now these networks that they use to explain the data, right, they implement the right dynamics, the right computations for a particular moment in the task. So in the beginning, when the monkey has to load the first frequency right into memory, that is achieved by point attractor dynamics. So this means a valley in this energy landscape. Then this state is maintained throughout the delay period by implementing line attractor dynamics, so a flat energy landscape. And then the decision is implemented by creating a saddle point, right? So a hill in the energy landscape so that the state falls to one side or the other corresponding to the two choices. And so that's a very elegant, simple explanation of how this task can be solved. And so this general idea, right, that you can explain the computations in terms of the dynamics at the level of the population is very powerful. It has been used now to explain many different kinds of computations across many different areas. This is just a very brief list of examples. Okay, and so this goes from winner-take-all competition, say in sensory areas, but also decision-making, transient amplification of sensory inputs and other kinds of inputs, pattern generation, and context-dependent gating and integration. And so what all of these models have in common is that so you can represent the activity in low-dimensional projections, right? So all of these plots show projection of population activity onto two axes, two patterns of activation, and then the effect of the recurrent dynamics is shown by these flow fields, right? So we show how the population activity would evolve in the absence of an input. And it's these flow fields, right, that together that interact with the inputs to create the computations. And so if one embraces this way of thinking about computation, then one basic question is how do we estimate these flow fields from population recordings, right? And this is going to be the goal of the work that I'm telling you about today. And this is a very basic thing one would like to be able to do in the same way as for single neurons, we want to be able to estimate the receptive field, right? Which describes how inputs are transformed into responses at the single neuron level. At the level of the population, you would have to understand how, what these flow fields are to understand how then the inputs are transformed into responses. And so I'll show you first that this is actually, even though this is a simple problem to state, it's actually not easy to solve. And all of this is actually on bioRxiv. Right, so why is this hard to solve? And so I'll show you again simulations of a few simple models. So this first model is one that is from Xiaojing Wang's lab. It was proposed as a model of decision making. So what I'm plotting here are, again, 2 dimensions of the dynamics at the level of population, so 2 panels of activity. And this flow field represents how the dynamics would evolve in this space, right, in the absence of an input. And so you can see this is, again, a saddle point right in the middle. You can either fall to the left or to the right into one of 2 attractors, which then represent the choices. So if we now provide an input to this neural network, essentially, so this particular input, what input does, it injects another push in a particular direction in this space, right? And I'm showing the nature of this push here at the bottom, right? So what is plotted here is the projection of the input along these 2 dimensions as a function of time. So in this particular case, is a time-independent input. And if you provide this input to the network, the activity will evolve along these trajectories. So the gray lines are single trials, so they're noisy. We also inject some noise. And then the blue is a condition average response, right? So we'll call these trial choice 1 trials because they fall to the right, and we can average them to get this blue trajectory. And so if you now provide an input in the other direction, we'll get trajectories that go to the other side, and we'll call these choice 2 trials. And now one thing that you notice is that these trajectories actually, both the single trials and the averages, right, they don't exactly follow these flow fields, right? And that's because the population activity is not only determined by the recurrent dynamics, it's also determined by the external inputs. And that has a very practical consequence, which is that we can now come up with a different model, right? This is now a different network that implements different recurrent dynamics, and so different computations. In this case, this is line attractor dynamics. We can choose, though, an input, right? In this case, it's a time-dependent input, shown here at the bottom, such that at the level of the condition averages, actually, these 2 networks are not distinguishable. And here's then another example, a third network that implements point attractor dynamics, but again, you can pick an input. It's a different one from the other 2, such that, again, the trajectories are all the same. And so this is a problem, right? Because in most practical situations, when you record from a particular brain area, you don't know what the inputs into that area are. And so this means that in practice, it's not possible to estimate, or it looks like it's not possible to estimate the recurrent dynamics, right, the full flow fields. Certainly not from the condition averages alone. So it turns out, though, that you can do better than looking at condition averages. And specifically, we can look at the variance, the variability of the responses around the condition average. So I'm going to zoom in here on these little squares, right? So here again, you see the condition average. You can see a number of single trials. And, instead of, so here is now one particular single trial, right, X. And so instead of trying to describe dynamics in terms of how, say, the single trial moves from time t1 to time t2, we're going to ask a different question. We're going to look at what we call residuals, right? So this is the difference between the position along a single trial at some time, t1, for example, and the position of the condition average at the same time, right? So here are 2 residuals, then at time t1 and t2, and we're going to ask how these vectors evolve. So if we put them next to each other, this black vector is what we want to estimate, and we call this the residual dynamics, right? And the residual dynamics, you can think of it as telling you how a perturbation away from the condition average, right, from this blue ball, in this case, a perturbation, towards the top in this part of state space, how that perturbation would evolve at the level of the residuals over one time step. And this idea of using residuals to try to infer something about dynamics is not a new idea. So here are just a few papers that have done this. What we're going to try to do here is to really obtain a quantitative, complete picture of the residual dynamics. Now, for these particular networks, actually, which we hand design, right, we can analytically derive what the residual dynamics is. And so this is what it looks like for these three networks for these particular times, right, along this trajectory. And this is now where the magic somehow happens. So when you look at the residual dynamics, you actually see essentially the recurrent dynamics that was governing, that was influencing the activity around this state. So on the left, the residual dynamics follows saddle point dynamics. So a perturbation along the horizontal direction expands, and perturbations along the vertical directions decay. For the middle plot, you get the residual dynamics that follows line attractor dynamics, and on the right, point attractor dynamics. And this is really, the key insight. So the residual dynamics differ strongly between these computations, right, between these networks, even though, again, at the level of the condition averages, they are identical. And under some assumptions, which I'm happy to discuss later, it only reflects the recurrent dynamics, not the inputs. So it doesn't matter if we don't know the inputs. And it also has some useful properties. For example, it has a fixed point at the origin, right? So this means that, this blue reference point is always a fixed point. And this means we can fit this residual dynamics with linear dynamical systems without inputs. And so I'm going to show you this in a second. What we're going to end up doing is we're going to estimate time-dependent local linear dynamics with a pipeline that involves a number of steps. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but really, number 4, deriving this pipeline was the big part of the work because it turns out that estimating residual dynamics accurately without biases is difficult because the signal to noise is quite small in real data. But we now have a pipeline that we're quite confident in. So what we can do then, I'm just going to show you what this pipeline spits out for these particular networks. So we're going to now simulate these networks, right, produce noisy responses, and then estimate these flow fields directly from the noisy responses using our pipeline. And I'm not showing you these estimated flow fields, so they would look essentially the same as the ones at the ground, as the ground truth that is plotted here. Instead, I'm going to show you here at the bottom some quantitative measure that we can extract from these flow fields. And the reason that we're going to use these measures is because in the data, we won't have the luxury of just having two-dimensional dynamics, right? So it would be higher dimensional. And then looking at flow fields is not very useful anymore. So we'd have to use these measures. So what do you see? So now we're, on the left, for example, we have the eigenvalues of the dynamics. And so one eigenvalue is larger than 1 for these flow fields. So this corresponds to the unstable direction along the horizontal axis. And one eigenvalue is smaller 1, so that means contraction along the vertical dimension. The line attractor is reflected by an eigenvalue of 1 or close to 1. Again, the other direction is contracting, so an eigenvalue is smaller 1. And then for a point attractor, both eigenvalues are smaller 1. And so this is now a characterization of the residual dynamics at this particular location, right, around the trajectory that is indicated by these squares. But now we can, estimate different residual dynamics at a later time, and we can do this at every time, and so then we will get curves of this kind. Now the residual dynamics is parameterized as a function of time here along the horizontal axis, but what time really is parameterizing is location along the condition average trajectory. And what that means is that we can effectively tile state space, into different locations and estimate different linear approximations at different locations in state space. And again, these look like now very abstract measures of computations, but they really contain all the information we need to distinguish these different models. Okay, so when we get eigenvalues larger 1, that's an instability, that's a saddle point. when we get eigenvalues close to 1, that's persistent activity, line attractor, or other things as well, for example, perfect rotations. And if we get eigenvalue smaller 1, that would be a point attractor. And there are other quantities, right? We can plot, not just the eigenvalues, and I'm going to show you one here, which are the singular values of the dynamics. So that's just another decomposition of the matrix, of the two-dimensional dynamics matrix. And what you can see is that the singular values are actually the same for the models on the left and on the right, but they're slightly different than the eigenvalues for the line attractor model. And this difference is a measure of non-normal dynamics. Right? So non-normal dynamics means that the eigenvectors of the dynamics are not orthogonal. And that is actually a critical feature of many models that have been proposed to explain dynamics in a variety of cortical areas. And so it's definitely something that one would like to be able to estimate from actual data. And in this particular case, right, what this eigenvalue larger, singular value larger 1 means that there is some transient amplification, which means that signals that decay on long time scales are actually transiently amplified on short time scales. Okay, so now we're going to apply this to actual data. These are prefrontal array recordings in macaques that were solving a version of the random dots task. So they saw a stimulus that moved either to the right or to the left, and then they had to integrate whether the motion was to the right or to the left by a saccade to one of 2 targets. And so these are Utah array recordings, so we have about 150 or 200 single and multi-units. So if you look at condition average trajectories, here on the left during the decision period, right, from stimulus onset to stimulus offset, and then during the movement period, right, so around the time of the saccade, you see things that are similar to what other people had found as well. So during the decision, right, you get this activity that separates to one side or the other, like in the models that I had shown you, right? So this is consistent, again, with a variety of models, saddle point, line attractor, and so on. And then the activity on the right, we get these very prominent rotations around the time of the movement, which are reminiscent of what is also observed, for example, in primary motor cortex during reaches. But again, by this point, you should understand that these trajectories per se alone don't really tell us everything about the underlying recurrent dynamics, so we're going to look at the residuals instead. And here they are. Okay, so this is now the key result. So here are the eigenvalues as a function of time, right, during the decision period and around the time of the saccade. And so here we're estimating a 6-dimensional flow field, which you think is the one that matters. So you see 6 curves. And so what can we read now from these? Well, first of all, they are all stable, right? So they can be fairly slow, right? So if you look at the time constants that are involved here, they can be quite long, right? Around 800 milliseconds. But what we certainly don't see is any instability, right? So we can rule out saddle point dynamics. We can look at the singular values, and we see that they are slightly larger than the eigenvalues. So the largest singular value is close to 1. So there is some evidence then of non-normal dynamics, but it's not very strong. And so we call this, transient persistence. So it's activity along some directions that kind of hangs around longer than it should, based on the, based on what you expect from the eigenvalues. And we can also look at other properties. So this I didn't show you in the models. This is some of these eigenvalues are complex, right? So you can look at the angle that they span with the real axis that tells you about rotational dynamics. And you can, look at the rotation frequency. And here there are some interesting observations that we didn't expect. So, for example, we find evidence of rotational dynamics also during the decision period. There is also rotational dynamics along at least one plane during the movement period. But it turns out that this happens at a time when the eigenvalues are strongly contracting, right? And what that means is a flow field that essentially spirals quickly towards the center. And it's not something that could explain the kind of rotations that we see at the level of the condition averages. So in terms of computations then in PFC, right, we can rule out a lot of models, right? So during the decision period, the residual dynamics is not unstable, right? So no saddle point. It's not persistent. It's not really a perfect line attractor. And also, we don't see any real non-normal amplification, right? So there is only this persistence. So overall, this is consistent with a leaky integration, meaning, you know, the long time constant, but still it's not infinite. And during the movement, you know, the residual dynamics is contracting. It's non-rotational mostly, and you know, some of the rotations that are observed in the residual dynamics actually do not match in terms of the planes where they happen to the rotations that we see in the condition averages, so they cannot explain the condition averages. And also, we don't see any non-normal amplification. And the conclusion from this is that, you know, these big deflections that we see in PFC cannot, or, you know, they have no match in the residual dynamics, and so they must be driven by external inputs. So, you know, you might wonder at this point, okay, why should you trust these estimates, right? So again, in the paper, we have a lot of controls as to, you know, where we show that these biases, these estimates are not biased, right? So they should be an accurate representation of the dynamics. But nonetheless, let me show you one additional piece of evidence that is kind of comforting, which is where we analyzed responses in another area, so in primary motor cortex, and actually found quite different results, okay? And what I should say, I'm not gonna show this, but the condition average responses are quite similar. So this is in M1. So this is a task very similar to the one that I showed you, with the one difference though that the monkeys were using reaches to indicate their choices rather than saccades. And here's what we get. So again, relatively low dimensional dynamics, which is stable or, you know, close to persistent, say before the movement, but now the big difference is that we find strong evidence of transient amplification, right? Singular values larger than 1, whereas eigenvalues at that time are smaller 1. And so this is, you know, the kind of non-normal dynamics that really was proposed in many models of you know, that try to explain movement activity in these areas. And also we find stronger evidence of rotations. So really, it looks like residual dynamics can show differences, right, between the computations in different areas that would not be apparent by looking at the condition averages alone, which was the whole hope of this approach. Right. I'm going to skip this, you know, to leave some time for questions. You can look at the paper. There is some interesting applications now of residual dynamics to you know, multi-area computations, and essentially in some cases it can allow you to distinguish, you know, local contributions to computations from global recurrency, right, inter-area connectivity. Okay, so in summary then, right, so estimating recurrent dynamics, meaning computations, if you believe in computations through dynamics, is an ill-posed problem when the inputs are known, right, so based on responses alone. The residual dynamics, which you can really think of as perturbations away from the average trajectory, can distinguish between different computations. And, you know, we applied this to PFC and M1 during decision-making movement generation and found differences, right, which are not apparent at the level of the condition averages. So this, you know, leak integration and input-driven movement responses in PFC compared to non-normal amplification and rotational dynamics in M1. And I didn't show you this, you know, you can also use these methods to capture multi-area computations. And you can maybe imagine, right, you can generate quantitative predictions actually of the consequences of any causal perturbations, right? That's really what residual dynamics is doing. And so I think it would be interesting to combine these methods with also experimental techniques to apply such perturbations. And I'll finish here. Thank you.